So, okay, so this is another online seminar with a guest lecturer. This is Dr. Benjamin Judkins from Cornell University. Dr. Judkins is a political scientist by training, but he works with me as co-editor of the journal Martial Arts Studies, and Ben is an expert on Chinese martial arts and their global spread and their global dissemination. He's written a book called The Creation of Wing Chun, which is about the invention of a Southern Chinese martial arts. And I thought it would be great to speak to Ben today about things around East-West binaries and cultural traditions and so on. So welcome, Ben. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Paul.
So yeah, thanks for attending. That's great. We're all under lockdown, and it's all a bit different. But one of the great things about it is that it just brings this in as a possibility. Like, hey, why don't we just, if everyone's using Zoom, why don't we just have guest lecturers in rather than me speaking to myself? So you've had a look at the module handbook, and you've read the readings. Is there anything, I mean, what leapt out for you? What did it speak to you at all? The themes around East-West binaries and body technology?
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. This it's critical from so many different perspectives. A lot of the work that I do is in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. And we see this very strongly because this is the heyday of nationalism, right? So in the late 19th century, everybody wants to be a nation. After World War I, everyone now sees a pathway to being a nation. But to be accepted as a nation, you had to have a few things, right? You had to have a Volk, you had to have a people, you had to have a homeland, you had to have a literature. So like everyone had epic poetry in the early 20th century. If you ever wonder why the Kalevala and epic poetry got big, this is why. But you had to prove that you had a folk culture. And so we see this explosion of people defining their own body images and their own body cultures in the early 20th century as a way to put themselves on the chessboard of history. And the stunning thing to me is that it just keeps going on over and over and over again. It wasn't just something that popped up once in the, early 20th century. We can see the same thing happening in the 1970s with early globalization. We can see the same thing happening in films that are being made in China and India now, right? It isn't just interesting to think about, how we visualize the world, but, go look at how those films visualize us as well. So it's just, once you get these basic ideas down, they're really powerful. They're very portable through history.
So you think that the rise of certain national things that we identify with different cultural traditions, like we identify yoga with India and we identify Tai Chi with China, and so this is you think this is some way related to nationalism?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that it's related to nationalism and to the marketing of national identities, right? The interesting thing about nationalism is it's outward facing and inward facing at the same time. You have to consolidate your population domestically around this notion that there is a nation, right? To quote Benedict Anderson, you got to get everyone to imagine that they're the member of the same community. And that's not necessarily easy, right? Even relatively small countries like France could be just horrendously linguistically and culturally diverse. And it takes a lot of work to get everyone to imagine that they are, the members of the same project. But in a sense, that's the easy bit. Because once you've got people internally imagining that, you then have to turn around and get the entire rest of the globe to accept you as that, to accept you into this growing nascent family of nations, right? And so selling that imagined community becomes huge. And these bodily cultures, I think, were viewed as the royal road to explaining to other people in the globe that, yeah, we have a distinctive culture that's valuable that is similar enough to what everyone else is doing that we deserve a place at the table, but it's different enough that you can't just fold us in with everybody else. We have to be acknowledged separately, right?
Yeah.
You know, like one of the things about Ben Spatz is that he makes this big differentiation between athleticism and somatic pursuits. But if you actually go back and look at the 1920s and 30s, and I've been doing this quite a bit in my research, it's those differentiations are not always as hard and as fast as he might lead you to believe. So if you look at the 1936 Olympics that happened in Berlin, of course, we have wonderful athletic events. You know, Jesse Owens goes and he does his thing. And clearly there's a big racial element to that and a big political element to that. But what we often forget is that some of the most popular events in the 1936 Olympics were not formal medal-bearing events. They were exhibitions of national culture that happened in the evening, where every one of these countries sent huge teams of people out, like dozens or in some cases hundreds of teams of athletes that did nothing except demonstrate their local physical culture traditions. And everybody came. It was packed. It was the most popular part of the Olympic event. And so, like the Indians were out there doing yoga as an exhibition, and the Chinese were doing Tai Chi as an exhibition, and people from Sweden were doing Swedish gymnastics as an exhibition, right? And we talk about the world stage as a metaphor, but suddenly the world stage was an actual stage with actual press critics on it. And what they thought about your exhibition of physical culture was about to become very, very important as we transition from the 1930s, which were bad, to the 1940s, which were horrific.
Okay. I mean, I think with Ben Spatz's with his work, when I read it, I didn't think that he was saying that there's always a distinction between like somatic bodily practices, things that we engage in just for the feel of them. So like we might do yoga, or we might do Tai Chi, or we might do Pilates, just because they feel great. I mean, we might even just go for a run because it feels great. But then we could do it for the healthism aspect, which is we could do it for the lose weight. We could do it. I read Ben Spatz as arguing that that's quite a recent transformation, so that maybe whereas in the 1930s yoga or Tai Chi or cricket or whatever was regarded as a highly nationalistic kind of piece of PR or a piece of nation building and image building, that more recently everything becomes evaluated in terms of like, will this make me thin and happy? Yeah. So I mean, like that
is true.
I think that I thought that his argument was that the healthism worldview that we now have, or that maybe we now have, or more and more people have, is quite a new development. I mean, what do you think?
It's hard. New development where and for whom, right? Because I understand why Ben is saying this. And I do think that this is where a whole bunch of critical puzzles in his book come up. Like he keeps putting, endurance sports like jogging, like, the ultimate endurance sport has no purpose. You just go and do it for as long as possible, right? He keeps putting it in the athletic category. And I'm like, when I jog, and all the people I know that we jog, we aren't really looking to set any distance records, right? I don't even know that we're looking to be thinner and healthier. Interesting thing about runners is they aren't all actually thin. And they're not all actually super interested in that. A lot of us jog strictly for the somatic experience of it.
Yeah.
Because we feel better when we do it. It's interesting, or we're localizing that question from, what can the body do to like, what can my body do?
Yeah.
Right. How do I tweak my personal performance? So research with a very small r. So I think that we've honed in on kind of some of the central issues with Spatz's, argument, in that the way people experience these things, and I'm sure he would certainly agree with that if he was here, right? is different from the ideal type always of how you would expect people to experience these things. I don't experience jogging as particularly competitive or particularly athletic, right? I think
Yeah.
I probably experience it more like what, he was describing as his third yoga school, right? Not the second competitive yoga school, but sort of the third yoga school.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Ben Spatz's treatment of the healthism paradigm, I think it's not quite complete, because I think that to complete this, you need to go to the idea of the datafied subject. Like
Yeah.
we're now data subjects with our Fitbits, which this is my act of subversion. Like, I'm not going to wear a Fitbit. I mean,
Mhm.
I barely, I mean, I was telling all the students in the lecture, like I don't time things. I don't, if I'm lifting, well, it's not strictly true. In the past, I would never count weights. I would never count reps. I would never count, or when it comes to running. But then when I got an iPhone and there was an app on it for like Runkeeper or something like that, then all of a sudden it became completely, all consuming. Like, is this run faster than the last run? And you've got the voice in your headphones going, like you have done, average speed, and your average speed is going down every mile. You're like, ah. So, and it kind of ruins it, and it kind of takes away the somatic experience of it, as a
Yeah.
joy or as a hobby or as a way of feeling good, and it transforms it into something else. Like, we're captured as subjects, we're recruited and pulled into this kind of Foucauldian or Deleuzian nightmare of monitoring everything and regulating everything. So I think that Spatz's healthism paradigm is more about the visual image. It's
Yeah.
like, it only makes sense if you're losing weight, or it only has value if you're getting a six pack, or if you're getting striations in your muscles or veins in your arms or something. You think?
Yeah, I think the idea of measurement is really critical. And I'm also curious, is like the how far we can push this, right? So there is definitely healthism in the yoga world and in the martial arts world today. I mean, it's the number one reason anyone says that they go into a yoga studio, or the number one reason anyone says that they go into like a taekwondo class or anything. I mean, probably any studio-based activity we can imagine is that they want to lose weight and be healthy, and they've kind of conflated those two things, and they have this very distinct visual image of what that looks like,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in the martial arts aspect of it, we can push that back to Bruce Lee, at least, right? Bruce Lee gives us this revolution in body image for, what a healthy martial artist should look like. And I think Spatz does a good job of problematizing that, asking, wait a second, was that body really healthy? And if these guys are so healthy, why are they so injury prone and always sick? Right? Valid questions to ask. But, if you go back and you look at the 1919 Jingwu anniversary book, which is published in Shanghai in 1919, the founders of Jingwu are all wearing honest to God leopard skins to show off like how ripped they are.
Do you want to tell the students what Jingwu is or was?
Okay, so this is a Chinese martial arts association that existed in the Republican period. So between about 1910, and people say it fell apart in 1926. It kind of like lingered on forever. But you're dealing with an organization from the early 1920s, and it was dedicated to teaching martial arts. But a very identifiable healthism was there, right? They weren't interested in teaching people self-defense. It was a type of healthism. But again, then the question is, well, how is it different? How is it a little bit different from what we've got going on today? And they were big into quantification again, and they liked bodies that looked like Bruce Lee's bodies. I think a lot of the things that people attribute to Bruce Lee that are as being very innovative is actually kind of Bruce Lee telling us about stuff that had happened in the 1930s that we had just totally missed, right? He knew about things from the 1930s because of his teachers, and when he lays it out in front of Americans, we're like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. It's like, yeah, well, you weren't in Shanghai in the 1930s. You didn't, you missed it, right? But those guys in the Jingwu Association are all looking like Bruce Lee. The difference is, though, that the goal is not personal health, it's the state, it's national health.
Yeah.
They're imagining different bodies. They aren't imagining a personal body. They're not imagining, I mean, they imagine personal goals, but they're not the end point, right? They're to get you to something else, right? And if we take it even further back in the Chinese martial arts, I've got, some texts from the 18th century that are talking about how great martial arts training is because it allows you to be fitter and healthier, right? So it is definitely kind of healthism. These are kind of elite people that are writing, obviously. So they're not so worried about being mugged in a dark alley. But, how they measure the health effect of the martial arts is their Confucian officials is like, I'm 60 years old and I can drop to my knees and kowtow whenever I have to do it in court. Instantly like that, just like a young man, and no one has to help me get up. And this is phenomenal, right? Because all my other civil servant buddies, it takes them a long time to get down, a long time to get up after they're kowtowing. But because I do martial arts, right, I can do my civil service duty. And so again, we have a notion of healthism, but the goals in the body that are imagined are changing through time, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, there's two other things that I definitely want us to talk about. And the first one is the idea of invented traditions as an academic kind of concept for how we understand these things. And the other one is the idea of the East-West binary, like there's an Eastern versus a Western, because these are things that I try to emphatically reiterate arguments about these things to my students. So I will, for instance, tell them that, according to, say, Mark Singleton, when his book is set as a chapter from his book is set as reading for one of these weeks in the module.
Oxford University Press.
Yeah. So his argument is that, so if you think about your 1936 Olympics,
mm-hmm.
and you have, Indian strongmen and yoga, and you have Chinese wushu or guoshu and tai chi, and so on and so on and so on. Different nations representing themselves in their practices. Often those representations would be a kind of mythic invention of an idea of an ancient tradition. So yoga, as is being demonstrated in that kind of context, could have been invented last month. Like it could be a choreographic display, like when we first saw river dance at the Eurovision Song Contest, right? And Michael Flatley brings out this troupe of like dozens and dozens of perfectly synchronized, astonishing dancers, and go, yeah, that's traditional Irish dancing. And like, yeah, it is. It kind of is, but it's a very different thing that's been reconfigured specifically for a kind of Hollywood-infused, orientalized fantasy about what Irish dancing is. So on the one hand, yes, the practice is an indigenous cultural practice. Yeah, kind of. But on the other hand, it's very much a kind of public relations display. It's been invented. And they can say this is our ancient tradition. So, I mean, how do we square that? How do we square the idea that we could choreograph a kung fu routine as
mm-hmm.
they do at the Olympics, and as they, like at the last, recent Olympics or New Year's Eve celebrations in Beijing, they make one up for it because it looks spectacular. Or they do it in Taekwondo all the time, and go, this is an ancient art that's at that 2,000 years old. They go, no, it's not. You just made this up now. How do we square the history with the invented tradition? Like there is a historical narrative, and then it gets reinvented. What do you, I mean, how would you explain the idea of invented tradition to my students? How are you going to explain it?
Oh, well, I suppose it all depends whether we want to focus today on the invented or the tradition part. Maybe the best way to start is to go back to, Hobsbawm and Ranger and look at their earlier distinction between custom on the one hand and invented tradition on the other hand. Right. I think that helps people get their mind wrapped around it. So it isn't all invented tradition all the way down. There are genuinely organic customs that exist in society and emerge, from society. So shaking hands, is a custom. It doesn't mean that we have always done it forever, right? But it's not a, top-down, socially engineered product. And the thing about customs is they can be quite old. Anthropologists are always coming up with great examples of weird little customs that have survived forever. But on the other hand, because there's not much social acknowledgement of them and social regulation of them, customs are actually free to change fairly frequently. So every once in a while, you find a custom that is really, really old, but other customs, just kind of emerge as the environment changes and technology changes, and it's just the way people interact with society and their environment, right? Yeah. And they learn a proper way to do it, and that's a custom. And notice we're talking about the people here. It's an organic process. When you get to an invented tradition, these are top-down processes, right? They don't come from the bottom up. They don't come from the people. They come from elites who generally have a goal. And the goal is, as we were talking about before in the early 20th century, it was to manipulate how the people understood themselves or how some other group of people understood them. Okay, so the inventiveness of inventor tradition starts when an elite looks at a body of custom and pulls something out of it, right? Yeah. Okay, so when we're talking about yoga, right, we're talking about, well, postures. We're talking about, the movement and breathing from one posture to the next posture. That's not everything that is in yoga. That's not most of what yoga was, and it certainly wasn't all of Indian physical culture, right? So my favorite thing about the history of yoga in the West is actually, because I did a lot of research on occult groups and occultism as a reaction to industrialization, right? So Aleister Crowley and all of these guys were always telling people to do yoga in the late 19th century, and whatever it was that Uncle Al was telling you to do, it was not what you find at your local studio, right? He's telling you to do really esoteric meditation and visualization practices because that was yoga. That was most of what was in Hatha yoga, right? Historically, Aleister Crowley's bizarre understanding of yoga is probably more historically accurate than our studio yoga today, right? Because again, he was looking at organic custom. Yeah. He'd actually traveled there. He knew what people were doing. Now that elite goes in and he generally, or she picks out one element and discards huge, huge amounts of stuff, right? That's really, for my money, what is critical to understand about invented tradition. It is the selective remembering of one thing, but it is the forgetting of lots and lots of other things. And that forgetting is a critical process because we have to get everybody imagining that they're doing the same thing and that they have always been doing the same thing. So you have to get them to kind of forget about all the other stuff that it was that they actually did or used to do, right? Yeah. And this is often a managed process through the manipulation of literature and the media and the education system. Mm-hmm. And once you're done with that, then you project it to the rest of the world. So again, we think about the 1936 Olympics, right? And we think about Indians doing, yoga, if they did in their physical culture displays. And yeah, there had been postures in certain sort of yoga traditions before, but the first part of invented tradition is asking, well, what else isn't there? Right? Okay, some people had done postures in some aspects of Hatha yoga practice, but you know what most people did? They did wrestling. Wrestling was really, really popular. All right, so do we see any wrestling on stage? Well, no. Why not? Well, because it's not a very elite thing. It's a kind of dirty in the mud kind of a thing. Plus, everyone in the world does wrestling. It's not very distinctive, right? So maybe if you're trying to showcase what is special and unique about Indian culture, you don't start with wrestling, okay? All right. What else don't we see? We don't see any dance. We don't see any music. Dance and music were core components of traditional Indian physical culture, right? That's all kind of been done away with in yoga. It's very clearly split off from that. Well, why aren't we going to put like dance on stage? Because dance is kind of feminine. And this is the Olympics, man. And we're all trying to show that, you know, we're a manly nation that can stand among other manly nations, right? And so you get Ben Spatz's, I think, very, you know, well thought out point here about, and Mark Singleton as well, about the repeated emphasis of, you know, athleticism and masculinity in the development of yoga to kind of push it in this direction. So to begin with, we discard lots of things. We zoom in on one thing. But then that one thing that we've zoomed in on, we usually have to remake. We're not even doing the postures of hatha yoga like they existed back in the day. What we're doing is we're transitioning between them quickly while coordinating our breathing. And why do you do that? Well, again, the 1936 Olympics are a great place to look because you will have Swedish gymnastics and Finnish gymnastics and like German gymnastics. And what do we see? People holding athletic postures and then transitioning from one to the next with a certain number of breaths in between them. So if you're Indian, you want to say, hey, look, we have our own unique postures and we can do it just like you guys can do it over there, right? And at that point, we now have a full-blown invented tradition, right? You know, yeah, something has been plucked from the past, but it has been fundamentally transformed to kind of fit the goals of elites. We're not in the realm of custom anymore. You know, we're in the realm of we're going to create the nation and we're going to craft all you people so you're subjects of the nation. And then we're going to sell it to those guys over there. And, you know, again, what do I want to focus on? If I want to focus on the tradition bit, I can find areas of continuity, right? I certainly can. And if I want to focus on, you know, the invented bit, I think I can find even more, you know, in terms of not even just the transformation, but man, the timing of the transformation. You look at the timing of when all of this happened, and it's just like, yeah, that's really revealing.
Yeah. And one thing that really I found really interesting in Mark Singleton's discussion of yoga is the thing in yoga still, I mean, when I learned it and talked to people about it, it's like everyone knows you hold a posture for 8 breaths and then you move on, right? And there's lots of different rationalizations for that. And Singleton says, well, it's probably more because that's about the amount of time it takes for the person talking through the demonstration to explain how you get into the posture and what to look for and how to relax. And so the person demonstrating, they breathe for 8 and then they move into the next, and so on and so on. But I get that. That's interesting that a tradition could emerge, and we can give it all sorts of esoteric meanings. Like it takes you that long before you find your center, and it takes you that long before the muscles can, and all this stuff. But it might just be a convenient amount of time. And I was wondering whether you saw any connection between certain kinds of capture technologies like photography. I mean, there's an argument that the emergence of bodybuilding as a thing, that like the here's my biceps kind of thing, is intimately connected with the proliferation of photography. And if you think about the logic of bodybuilding, it's very much a static, like snap, 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 snap. You know, like take the photo. It's not a cinematic thing like kung fu or dance. It's and also with bodybuilding, you can only exist in that state of like vascularity and leanness for like a few days. You know that, so it's very much a kind of static, snap, frozen in time, abstracted, impossible. You know, the photograph has that duration. Like you put the photograph on the wall, and it's like, my God, Arnold Schwarzenegger always looks like this, when it's a lie. But it's so therefore the media technology is what produced the embodied practice. And I'm wondering if you go back to the kind of 1930s nationalist, you know, mass displays of this is our nation, if there's a connection with, you know, photography, basically. Do you think? Or
yeah, well, and the really interesting thing about the 1930s is the mass display of our nation, right? So you have finally got really good film with sound in it, cheap, and networks where you can move it around the world and everybody can see your newsreel, right?
Yeah.
And so you can have those mass rallies wherever it is that you happen to be, building your nation, right? And that, it fits so well with the somatic aspect of community building. Like, if you're trying to convince people that they, are Chinese, and so by doing kung fu, they're Japanese by doing kendo, they're Indian by doing yoga, right? What happens is you do yoga and you have certain somatic experiences and you feel it in your body. And it's like, this is what it means. This is what it feels like to be Indian, right? This
Yeah.
is what it then means to be Indian. I mean, it's hard to put your faith in religion or your faith in something that you can't see, but somatic experience is something that you can feel, which means it's an easy object to put faith into. Then if you can match that picture of that mass rally of everyone doing it, and you can map yourself and your bodily experience onto this giant national wide spectacle, right? Those two things I think are intimately connected. The ability to reproduce the everyone doing it with the personal experience of, and it exists within me,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, I mean, I think that you're getting really close to understanding, what was just tearing through like the global media culture of the 1930s and 40s, right? Because you see this in so many different places. Again, it's easy to point to the 1936 Olympics or things that the Nazis were doing, but we can look at things that are going on in the United States. We can look at things that are going on in Japan and China. Everyone seems to have imagined what you can do with this technology really fast. And if they didn't figure it out themselves, all they have to do is watch somebody else's propaganda film and they're like, oh God, yeah, well, we need to get on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that spread really quick.
So, I mean, to move to the idea of an East-West binary, it's a very difficult thing to get out of, isn't it? So the idea of, I mean, one of Singleton's propositions about something like postural yoga is that it's sold internationally as a kind of traditional Indian thing, but a lot of its development took place and continues to take place outside of India.
Yep.
Much the same as Brazilian jiu-jitsu, much of its development is very far removed from Brazil nowadays. But cricket, right? It's
Right.
very the advantage in, it's like, if you're playing cricket somewhere in the world, you're not necessarily doing an English thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but still, we constantly kind of we want our desire is to slot it into an Eastern or Western category. So this, I mean, we talk about Orientalism, the students know about Orientalism, and yet when you think about something like yoga or something like Tai Chi or Wing Chun Kung Fu or Taekwondo, you want to nationalize it and you want to Orientalize it. Um, so, I mean, to what extent are any of these practices, to what extent is an East-West binary valid? And to what extent, and how do you deal with this thing, this tendency in thought to binarize? I mean, we see it everywhere. We're not just talking about undergraduate student essays here. We're talking about like really experienced academics and scholars. They operate within an East-West binary that they don't problematize. I mean, how do we function with that?
Well, maybe, do you have that slide that I sent you with
Yes.
the two bodies? Maybe this
Let's
is a
have a
good
look.
time to bring up our two body problem.
So you want these
Like,
two bodies? Let's share the screen. This one?
yes, exactly. So this is a page, a set of pages from a book on the history of medicine by a Harvard professor, Japanese American guy, very smart. He, of course, has a PhD in the history of science. He's got another degree in acupuncture. And, on the left, we see a Chinese body, kind of an idealized Chinese body from a medical text.
Hmm.
And on the right, we see this idealized European body, but kind of looking back to, it's Renaissance, obviously, but looking back to the Greek tradition, the classical tradition of sculpture. And, let's start breaking it down. I mean, like, these are both authentic representations of how bodies were imagined in medical practice in two different cultures, right? I can't help but notice that, the Western body really emphasizes muscles, right? We have stripped everything away down to the level of muscle, and muscle is what we have left revealed. I mean, maybe that guy wasn't so skinny when he was alive, but once we flayed him, all right, and we're down to muscles, this is what we've got, right? Our Eastern body is kind of portly, right? It doesn't show any muscle. Now, he might be quite strong, but you would never know, until you see him lift something. Um, our Western body is dynamic. It is in motion. Okay, it's doing something. The Eastern body is static. The Eastern body is at rest, right?
Yeah.
All of this really speaks to that kind of East-West binary. And the particular author who drew on these illustrations basically argued that, ancient Greek physicians and ancient Chinese physicians experienced the body in fundamentally different ways. The way that they experienced the body in ancient Greece was incommensurable to what was going on in China. As a matter of fact, I mean, the way they experienced the body in ancient Greece is probably incommensurable to how we experience the body today. In a sense, incommensurability just means you're in a different culture. This is one of the ways of defining culture. When you get to a point where things are incommensurable, where you can't understand across the boundary, well, that's how you just crossed a cultural boundary. So I don't want to reify or mystify the term incommensurability too much.
Okay.
But it's pretty clear that Western medicine and Eastern medicine did end up developing along substantially different lines, because you started off with different images of the body. So kind of like getting back to our invented tradition discussion, yeah, there's something there. I mean, people did come up with fundamentally different ways of understanding and experiencing the body, and they have transferred through history. However, there are other ways in which we talk about the East-West binary that I have, I don't think that, I think that this image problematizes, right? So one of the things that we do is, we say, the West is the realm of, science and stale rationality, and the Eastern picture is the realm of nature and holism, right?
Yeah.
That would be kind of standard.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we see, a body existing in harmony with nature? Well, it's actually in the Western image, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of makes sense, because if we think about it, the Renaissance, yeah, they were trying to, kind of replace God at the center of creation with man. So putting man into context with creation, putting the human body into context of the natural world, actually is a very Renaissance kind of a thing. Where do we see abstract theoretical isolation? You kind of see it in that other body. To say that we see movement in one body, but movement in but the other body is static, again, that's kind of a first level cut. That's kind of an undergraduate level cut at this, but it's problematic in that the movement is external in the Western body, but in the Eastern body, it's full of movement, but it's tracking internal maps of movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what those acupuncture lines are about. They're about the movement of energy and life and vitality through the body, right? Maybe what we could actually say is that, looking at these two pictures, is that one has externalized it and one has internalized it. Yeah, but again, at this point, we're drawing a lot from these two pictures. So I think we have to be careful in terms of blithely dismissing cultural differences.
Hmm.
They exist, but they certainly they tend to be much more complicated than we think they are. You know,
Yeah,
for instance, that notion that the West is always taking the body out of nature, that doesn't strike me as correct at all. I mean, you know, in the West, what we keep, yeah, sure, we've got science, but like we reinvent romanticism every 40 years. Like seriously, every 40 years we're reinventing romanticism. For what purpose? Other than to emphasize, you know, the Western body, you know, exists in nature, right?
yeah. Okay. So what you're emphasizing then is, I'll stop sharing this screen now, I guess. We'll come back to that if we need to. But um, so you're emphasizing the existence of cultural difference. So if we were going to be writing an essay about this stuff, we can acknowledge that there is cultural difference. I mean, vast differences even within the same supposed nation. You mentioned earlier, like a country like France, for example, has been a huge
Yes.
problem. It's a huge nationalizing of people is a profoundly difficult problem. There is
Yeah.
cultural difference everywhere, like, you know.
And be very careful, by the way, if you're going to talk about Chinese medicine in broad terms, because oh my God, is that a diverse field?
Yes,
Not like all those Chinese medical practitioners agree with each other about anything.
exactly. So that's the point I was going to raise. So I mean, the way I deal with the idea of a binary is you acknowledge cultural difference. There is always cultural difference. That there's cultural difference in this street. There's vast differences of experience and practice, and but that, like Jacques Derrida argued, that you have to be careful about collapsing difference into opposition. So, you know, if you start to say, well, there's a European tradition and then there's say a Chinese tradition, you're already painting in hugely wide, broad brushstrokes. Because, like, what does it mean to say we can often often in the West, perhaps we can say the Chinese do this. This is how it's done in China. But you're talking about an astonishingly huge and diverse place.
Yep.
It'd be like saying in Europe we do this. Like, we don't do anything the same in Europe. You know, you don't do the same things across states in America, in North America, in the USA.
And even
So
the same state, just from generation to generation.
yeah,
Like I said, we keep reinventing romanticism. You know, like when I was reading your module, the thing that actually rushed to my mind wasn't martial arts yoga. I started thinking about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein.
aha,
It was like,
mhm,
so is Frankenstein the ideal scientized Western body?
yeah,
Well, in some senses, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's like virgin birth from science. And immediately that was a bad idea, which was the point of the story,
yeah.
right?
And
So,
I mean, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I mean that is the birth of Gothic horror and science fiction. It's like it's the same birth of the dystopian mutation of a kind of a human dream into the undead, the living dead,
exactly.
and science being a monstrosity. Which I guess is interesting because it segues into something that we're going to be talking about with when we look at deconstruction, either later on this week or next week, or it's like, when is it going to be? I don't know. Time is meaningless now at the moment for us. It's
Right.
day or night. I'm in room, but yeah. So Frankenstein and the idea of the I'm going to build the perfect body, which actually is a monstrous body. Um, yeah,
Right.
yeah. Which actually, I mean, so then what you said that, and what that segues into my head straight away is something that we also talked about on the module, which is some students did presentations on topics like this, is the desire for perfection in cosmetic surgery
Oh, yeah.
leads to a kind of like a perverse aberration away from, like, we want to try to perfect the body, we want to make the perfect human body. So this is Pygmalion, isn't it? So
Mhm.
Frankenstein is the modern Pygmalion, and the story of Pygmalion is the man who dreams that his perfect statue can come to life, but then everything goes wrong. So the idea of the perfect body as becoming monstrous, like the attempt to realize perfection always produces some kind of monstrosity, whether that
And
be.
I think that immediately problematizes your East-West binary. Not to say that the binaries don't exist. I want to come back to their existence, but it problematizes, I think, how they function within societies, and that these aren't ideal types. I mean, we cannot articulate one end of the spectrum without, it's like a yin-yang kind of a thing, also bringing in the counter argument, right? You know, people are intensely aware of the limitations, and you know, you actually see this in the fiction and the storytelling and the talking, you know, that occurs around these things.
Yeah.
So then I think the issue is, well, why do we keep getting the binaries?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the production of the binary is not an accident. They get produced because they're useful to somebody.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the Chinese have a wonderful habit of self-orientalization that really illustrates this, you know, where, you know, Westerners said, or they interpreted Westerners as saying, I think that's an important distinction that we have to make when you look at how Chinese nationalists approached the global press. The global press didn't always say the things that the Chinese nationalists were paranoid that they were saying. In truth, the global press rarely talked about China. It wasn't important enough at the time. But, you know, they would interpret the global press as saying one thing, and the Chinese would just like own it. It was like, okay, we're going to go there to the max, and we're going to show you that that is really a virtue. And now everyone is going to do that, right?
Yeah.
And again, that kind of speaks to the top-down aspect of invented tradition, right?
Yeah.
But that also speaks to its, you know, its plasticity. It's not that these things don't get stabilized and that they don't have a certain social reality. They absolutely get stabilized.
Yeah.
But for short periods of time for specific reasons. So last night, to prepare for this, I decided I needed to stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning watching Jackie Chan's, one of his latest films, Kung Fu Yoga.
Yeah.
Have you seen Kung Fu Yoga, Paul?
I haven't, but you know, I'd forgotten I was planning to watch it. I was like, I saw an advert, I thought, and then life happened, and so I will be watching that soon. Tell me about it.
Watch it with your kids. They are going to love it. There is nothing highbrow about Kung Fu Yoga. It is basically an extended ripoff of Indiana Jones films and like Tomb Raider films. If you take like Indiana Jones and Tomb Raider and you smash them together and then you fill them with Jackie Chan and his buddies, you know what you're getting here, okay? Yeah. But the thing, I mean, there's so much we could talk about with this, but the thing that's interesting in terms of this module is that the East-West body paradigm is perfectly reproduced, even though we're dealing in this movie with two Eastern countries, okay. Right?
Yeah.
But now Chinese bodies in that film are kind of assigned the role of the ideal Western type, that it's all about science and technology and masculinity and hardness and getting shit done. And Indian bodies are assigned the ideal Eastern type, in that they are all female, like literally all of the important Indian characters are female, right? And they don't do kung fu, and they certainly don't fight. They do yoga, right? But they're also romantic, and they're more technologically primitive, and they can't do anything with without the Chinese helping them. And you would think, if this was a typical Hollywood film, how it would go is that at some point Jackie Chan would discover that kung fu and yoga must come together, and he must augment his kung fu with a little yoga so that he can overcome the bad guy at the end.
That's what I'm expecting. Yeah, that's what I'm expecting.
Well, I'm going to spoil it for you. It's not going to happen that way. The binaries are going to remain distinct, and the one chance in which Jackie Chan has to actually use a little bit of kind of fake yoga to help him save his life, he is literally going to say, I would rather die than do yoga.
Okay.
And he will almost die rather than doing yoga, right? I mean, and it struck me as so revealing the, kind of, the masculinity of Jackie Chan's character in there, that literally, like, we're going to endanger the entire film and the mission so that we don't have to watch a Chinese guy attempt to do yoga. That, that can be reserved for the very beautiful, winsome, Indian women that have been brought on set for that explicit purpose.
So, I mean, there are interesting questions about who was the money behind this film. I mean, who made it? Is it Hollywood, or is there Chinese money in it?
It's Chinese money.
So I think this is crucial now, because that really helps us to work out why certain structures are in place. It's like Megan Morris once pointed out that
she should be part of this conversation.
Should be part of this conversation. So Megan Morris was talking about, there was a film came out, was it Doctor Strange? And in Doctor Strange, there is a kind of Tibetan immortal, and played by a white woman. And everyone, and all the academics in the West went, Orientalism. It's Orientalism. They couldn't face having an Asian woman as a blah 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 blah. And Megan Morris
as a Tibetan sage, yeah.
And she just went, no, this is because the touchy subject in China is Tibet, and you are not going to have a film do well in China if you have a Tibetan character being some kind of hero. So the safest thing to do is make it an ethnicity that doesn't matter. White woman doesn't matter in the current configuration. So you need to think about where the money is and where the energy is, and who's calling the shots and why. But the other thing that I often think is it, the question I ask of a film is it possible to do a national allegory reading of this? So Frederick Jameson once argued that you should approach all literature as national allegory and kind of see what happens. Mm-hmm. So, like, what's the national allegory here then? If this is a Chinese film made with Chinese money, then the national allegory is then that China now is precisely, as you say, the rational, powerful, go-getting, ba-ba-ba-ba-bang nation, and that the nation that's, I guess, that is like soft and ancient and feminine is India.
I don't think it's going to be a stretch to do your national allegory. The film is a national allegory. It just straight up is.
Okay.
That's kind of the extent of what happens in the film, actually, is national allegory. That, and there is one great scene with a lion in a car, but there's a lion in national allegory.
Okay. So we could talk about that, but I haven't seen it yet, which would be but yeah, we could just do, like, what can you predict about this film? How many elements can you predict?
Well, I mean, the thing that was shocking for me, though, was that there is a Hollywood pathway for telling the story, right? And the Hollywood pathway is the two must come together and there must be a synthesis. And maybe it's going to be a false synthesis. I mean, it's almost always a false and dismissive synthesis, but we didn't even do that. The two did not come together. The two remained distinct to the end. And, they had to work together, mm-hmm. right? But they certainly weren't going to come together. And it's like, well, why? Why? It's, I think, when you bring the question of how national identity and gender identity interact, that you realize in that specific context, it really kind of put the kibosh on, any possibility of Jackie Chan becoming a yoga instructor by the end of the film. That just could not happen.
Okay, I really need to see this film. I'm speculating as to why that might be, but I don't want to keep the students.
Well, I think your students need to see this film too.
I think they do. Yeah, I think they do. I wish we could all kind of. I wish, I found myself yesterday wishing that I could get up at 5 a.m. to get on a train at 6 a.m. to get in good time to make sure I could to do a lecture at, like, if you asked me a few weeks ago, I'd have gone, oh my God, the worst thing about Mondays is getting up at 5 a.m. But I want to close this off. I don't want to keep the students too long or make this be too long a recording. What I would normally do in a kind of real live lecture would be to kind of try and touch on some of the key points, and I guess you can tell me if I'm wrong, but what I would want the students to take away from this, because they're thinking about doing their essays now, so they choose whatever it is they want to do their essays on, right? And I think that I would argue that there is always cultural difference, but that cultural material is filtered through lots of, like, either media fantasy processes or kind of ideological processes. So you're never going to, it's really difficult to start thinking about a true essence to, like, to think of something like yoga as a true essence of Indian culture misses a huge amount of information, like the fact that most of it was developed in the West. It's a 20th century invention. We've got to connect it to like the market for it and what it's being branded as. I mean, so just quickly, slight digression. Since this lockdown, people have been sharing ways to cope, like sharing it online, like do yoga or buy this new clever football, this soccer ball, so you can train in your room, or buy this exercise equipment. And a friend of mine had shared a yoga class, like a yoga with so and so. I won't say the name. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, I'll give it a go. I mean, I have my own yoga routine. I did yoga a long time ago, but I thought I'll give it a try, get some new information. And I lasted about maybe 30, maybe 60 seconds into this yoga class, because it was a white American woman, and she's in this kind of really plush studio, and she's going, now we're going to begin by finding our center. And I was like, no, this is all of the cliches. This is all of the stereotypes. Like, it's just, there was even plinky plonky music going on. And I was like, so what this text is doing, what this branding is, the positioning of this practice is doing, is it's orientalizing it. But that's purely mythic, and it's kind of more like a new age hybrid. So
I think the story about yoga is it's been a new age hybrid all the way down.
Yeah.
The thing that's really interesting to me about Mark Singleton's book is that it reveals that the new age hybrid didn't start in the 1970s. It literally is a turtles all the way down situation. And what I walked away from that with is, I need to pay a lot more attention to that process of new age hybridity. It's really important, right? It's important for understanding the 19th century. It's important for understanding the birth of modernism. But then again, I was the same guy who was looking at, esoteric magical traditions as a reaction against, industrialization. So that may be, a personal bias of mine. But to see those same questions brought up in the birth of yoga, actually, I suddenly got really interested in why white middle class women, in the 1950s immediately found this to be something that was so familiar to them. And looking at the various harmonization movements and stuff like that, that was really cool for me when I read about that the first time.
Okay, I mean, that's a good word that I would draw to my students' attention, the idea of a hybrid. So you're never really looking at an essence of anything. It's always probably going to be a hybrid of something, or a simulation, a manufactured, kind of overproduced image of something. So yeah, but we've talked for an hour. I'm gonna, unless any of the students want to be brave enough to ask a question, or you can follow up by email with me, or we can sort something else out. But if not, guys, I'm gonna invite you to leave. I'm gonna stop this recording now, and I'm gonna chat to Ben for a little bit longer afterwards. But thank you all for attending. I will stop the recording.